Camilla Köhnken is a pianist, historical performance practice expert, and artistic researcher from Bonn, Germany. She studied with world-renowned pianists Pierre-Laurent Aimard in Cologne, Jerome Rose in New York, and Claudio Martinez Mena in Basel. Since 2014, Camilla has been working on interpretation strategies of the 19th century, specifically regarding the question how to escape the narrow limits of 20th and 21st century piano performance etiquette, mostly in Beethoven repertoire. On her website, she describes her fascination with 19th century interpretation habits as reflected by early sound documents, including piano rolls and early gramophone recordings, in the music by Beethoven, Liszt, and Chopin. The focus of her 2018 dissertation at the University of Bern in Professor Kai Köpp's research project on instructive editions were the interpretation strategies of the Liszt circle. In the following video, which is a snapshot of Camilla Köhnken's recent research, she participated in a project at Orpheus Institut where she performed a piece by Franz Liszt, En Rêve, which has the instruction una corda and dolce and a dynamic range of piano and pianissimo. However, the project was a project to demonstrate how it was back in the day to play into a phonograph, which was an early technology for recording. And so how it worked was that you really had to hammer out a piece of music in order for it to even be caught on the medium. I was fortunate enough to conduct an interview with Camilla. I was moved and inspired by hearing about her ideas of performance practice and what today's pianists can learn from old recordings and from an approach that leaves behind text and Werktreue ideologies in order to explore the freedom with which many of the early performers approached issues of form, for example.
The main force that drives me when I play, I think, is my desire to communicate with others, like most of us players. I do love to practice also by myself, but it's just always in preparation for really going out on stage. That's the end goal. In general, I was always a bit weirded out by the division between musicology and active musicians, but also by the division between musicology and artistic research. I think there's a lot to be learned from each other, and there should be as much collaboration as possible. For my own music history-based research into interpretation strategies of the 19th century, I'm interested how playing core repertoire still of today actually feels on the fortepianos or later 19th century instruments of the time in which these compositions were written, how it might have sounded in a space of that time actually, and what people then expected or were shocked by, which is of course very different to what we are shocked by today, and feed all these experiences back into my own playing.
Yeah, it sounds really wonderful, amazing, and it sounds like it could really contribute to a slightly freer approach, not only for you, but also maybe for the way that you perform with others and the way you teach. So how has it changed the way how you work with the text that's in front of you as a musician?
Right. I think it really brought me away a little bit from the rules which are instilled still in the students of today, the 20th, 21st century conservatory rules of staying religiously in the same tempo and the so-called Urtext mentality. Listening to historical recordings from the beginning of the 20th century, the long 19th century, so to speak, really taught me a lot of new possibilities, and all in all, it really freed me up in my own playing. Turns out that people from that time were much more experimental with what they saw, and they thought that it really belongs to the tasks of an interpreter to show your own way of understanding the music and not just play it according to certain rules. So, for example, tempo fluctuation is a very important topic.
I'm reminded about your article, which I have studied in detail. And so you write something really interesting there. And so I'm wondering, like, when you play Beethoven today, with all the amazing research you've done on Hans von Bülow, who, as you write, also somehow had a slightly different relationship with the text than we might think today. So I wonder if you can briefly talk about how playing Beethoven today, with all the research that you have done on Hans von Bülow, these editions, how is that for you today?
Yeah, I mean, one important point is always the tempo, in which tempo to take a piece, and then how strictly to stay in that tempo. And it seems that in these times, even though they were talking about Taktfestigkeit, like to stay in tempo, it meant something really different than what we mean today. Also, it freed me up for sure, let's say, in my own playing. Because until then, like during my education, I learned the common rules of 20th, 21st century conservatory education. Let's take a random example. You may not slow down when the second theme arrives, the lyrical theme of the first movement in a sonata, let's say. You have to somehow, that's what I learned at least, you have to somehow make it work, the lyricism within the main tempo.
And so when you play, do you realize audience reactions when you kind of play in a way that is really different than what people today expect?
Right.
And so do you notice anything with regard to the dynamic that you have with your audience?
I don't notice while I play, because first of all, you are in it, and also today's audiences are very well behaved, so they usually just keep still. But I had many reactions afterwards that people were either interested and moved by how different it was, but also many who were outraged and said, what was that? And it's really not right. So
I think we have a perfect transition to the second question here, which is, what does it mean to be a performer in your own body and in your own experience and in your own world? And what we've just discussed in the last few, I guess, minutes, that was already in this direction. I'm just really intrigued about your approach of kind of educating today's audience to also let go of some of these expectations that they might have.
Yeah, it is really a great self-experiment to also jump over certain inner walls and boundaries you build up during your studies, that you may not do this or that. And it's very deeply ingrained that we almost cannot do certain things, or it takes some practice. So when I first listened to historical recordings, I was just like everybody usually from our times, a bit shocked and thought, how sloppy, how weird. And then I started to understand it, why they were doing things, and then I was more and more convinced. But then there's still a huge step into doing that yourself in a convincing way. One step is to really do a very similar, as similar as possible emulation or embodiment of what you hear. The next step would be a more artistic one, to transfer it to other pieces, for example, of the same composer, and find your own way of handling these interpretation strategies. But it is not so easy, first of all, to just technically realize what they were doing also on today's instruments in today's settings, and then also to really get over your own constraints, especially on stage when you are more nervous and often more rigidly clinging to what you know already from decades of practice.
Yeah, it's wonderful how closely these areas interact in your work. So what I hear is that on the one hand, you're really inspired by the sound of the old instruments, to which, as I read in your biography, you have access to some really wonderful older instruments at the Beethoven House in Bonn. So I'm inspired by that, and also how, because of your knowledge of Liszt performance practice, Liszt interpretation, and the time, that also gives you a lot of material to work with.
Exactly.
So those are the areas I hear, and I'm extremely interested because of how well you connect those two. And I cannot wait to come to performance of you live, so that I can also be shocked by the way that you take these liberties in your playing, and you really you challenge the audience to listen to music in a new way, this way.
One is already very known, and that is Hans-Jörg Reinberger. One paper I really like is Experiment, Forschung, Kunst. The second tip, here is Tom Begin. He just this year published his book. It's called Beethoven's French Piano, A Tale of Ambition and Frustration. And this is a kind of artistic research when we talk about tastes of of our discipline that I can really identify with, like to go back to the instruments of that time, to the historical background of that time, but then really try to get into the mind of the composer, or try to identify with the player performer of that time and try out things, and then sometimes in the best case arrive at quite striking and interesting or enriching interpretations.